Hey everyone, I'm your host Peter Zablocki, and you're listening to History Shorts. I hope everyone's having a great day so far, and thank you for making this show a small part of that. If you'd like to help me out with a small gesture, please leave History Shorts a rating or a review, and click that subscribe button if you haven't already done so. For sources and books used as the basis for these episodes, how to advertise on a show, and other information such as a list of our upcoming guests on the Conversation series, or a link to our Patreon account where you can find exclusive episodes not heard here, please visit www.historyshortspodcast.com. Today's episode is brought to you by the Podcast Republic, your ultimate podcast listening app. Discover and subscribe to thousands of podcasts from around the globe, all in one place. Download Podcast Republic now and take your podcast experience to the next level. Having said all of that, in the early 15th century, Florence was a city of energy, elegance, and enormous tension. It pulsed with trade and wealth, bursting at the seams with guilds, bankers, and thinkers. The Black Death had receded, and the Medici family was on the rise. Gothic shadows still lingered on its churches, but a new artistic spirit was taking hold, an awakening of classical ideals, proportion, and humanist thought. And it was with this fiery crucible of ambition and rebirth that two of the greatest creative minds of the Renaissance collided. Lorenzo, Ghiberti, the golden boy of sculpture, and Filippo Brunelleschi, the defiant genius of architecture. Their rivalry, sometimes bitter, sometimes brilliant, was not merely a personal feud, but a contest over the future of art itself. Here is the rest of that story.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The stage for this story was set in 1401, when Arte di Calimala, the powerful Florentine cloth merchants guild, announced a competition to design new bronze doors for the Baptistery of San Giovanni, one of the oldest and most sacred buildings in Florence. The project was monumental in both scale and symbolism. The Baptistery was the spiritual heart of the city, where generations of Florentines, Dante among them, had been baptized. The guild intended to replace the existing door with something breathtaking, something to glorify both God and Florence. Artists from across Italy were invited to submit samples. The brief was deceptively simple. Each artist was to create a bronze relief panel depicting the sacrifice of Isaac, the dramatic Old Testament moment when Abraham raises a knife over his son, only to be stopped by an angel. The competition drew 7 people, but only 2 stood above the rest. Ghiberti, just 23 years old, and Brunelleschi, only 24. Both submitted stunning panels, each showcasing a unique interpretation of drama, composition, and style. Ghiberti's version was elegant and balanced. Abraham's arm was raised, but the scene remained harmonious, classical in proportion and mood. Brunelleschi's panel was altogether more violent, with raw tension etched into every fold. Abraham's hand gripped Isaac's hair, the knife pressed close to flesh, and the angel lunged to stop him. Ghiberti demonstrated grace, Brunelleschi raw emotion. The judges were torn. Ghiberti's work showed exquisite craftsmanship. He had a flair for casting and used less bronze, making the piece lighter and thus cheaper. Brunelleschi, on the other hand, had produced a more daring design, but with less concern for cost or tradition. Eventually, the guild offered the commission to both men, hoping that they would collaborate. It was a delicate compromise meant to preserve peace in a proud city, but Brunelleschi would have none of it. He rejected the offer outright, refusing to share the task with anyone, especially with someone that he saw as a rival, if not a lesser talent. He abandoned the doors and turned away from sculpture altogether. For the next decade, Brunelleschi would devote himself to architecture and engineering, pouring all his frustration into the dream of building the impossible, a dome for the massive, unfinished Florence Cathedral, Santa Maria del Fiore. Ghiberti, meanwhile, seized the opportunity. Over the next 2 decades, he completed the north doors, a masterwork of bronze artistry, 28 panels showing scenes from the life of Christ, framed by intricate foliage and crowned with classical motifs. The doors were hailed as triumphs. The guild was pleased. Ghiberti's fame soared. He became the darling of Florence, renowned for his charm, refinement, and success. But Brunelleschi did not forget. In secret, he studied the great Roman ruins, traveling to Rome with his friend Donatello and measuring ancient columns, pantheons, and aqueducts. He sketched, theorized, and calculated. While Ghiberti polished his saints in gold, Brunelleschi deciphered the mysteries of classical architecture. He taught himself engineering in an age before blueprints, formulas, or professional training. He imagined domes, arches, and ribs that could rise without scaffolding, an idea so radical no one dared to believe it. Then came the moment he had waited for. In 1418, the cathedral's board announced a new competition to design and construct a dome over the cathedral's vast yawning crossing, a space of 150 feet wide and 180 feet above the floor. For decades, the cathedral had stood incomplete, capped only by a temporary wooden roof. No one had dared attempt a dome on such a scale since ancient Rome. The Pantheon had a similar span, but it had been poured with unreinforced concrete, a technique that was lost to time. Florence wanted a dome of masonry, built with bricks and mortar, and with no flying buttresses, which were seen as too French. Dozens of builders, artists, and engineers submitted plans. Once again, the finalists came down to Brunelleschi and Ghiberti. Ghiberti had by this point become a wealthy and respected master. He had completed the baptistry doors and was working on a second set. He was a favorite of the guilds and known for his smooth diplomacy. Brunelleschi, by contrast, had no formal architecture experience and no powerful patrons. He was, however, intense, eccentric, and secretive. But he also had one thing that Ghiberti lacked: a vision. Brunelleschi proposed a radical design, a double-shell dome with horizontal ribs and herringbone brick pattern that would allow it to rise without full scaffolding. He would use ox-powered hoists, gears, and cranes of his own invention, all borrowed from what he had witnessed and saw when touring Rome. He even designed machines to carry materials hundreds of feet into the air, a feat that had never been attempted. The committee was intrigued, but cautious. They demanded a demonstration. Brunelleschi, always theatrical, arrived with an egg. He placed it on the table and asked if any of the architects present could make it stand upright. All failed. Then he took the egg, cracked its bottom, and stood it on the flattened base. The message was clear. Once you see how it's done, it looks easy, but only the inventor knows how to begin. He was awarded the commission. Well, sort of. In a compromise eerily reminiscent of the earlier doors competition, the committee appointed both Brunelleschi and Ghiberti to oversee the dome's construction. Once again, they would be expected to collaborate, and once again, the result was tension, rivalry, and one man gradually emerging as the true master. Brunelleschi, suspicious of sabotage, revealed only parts of his plan at a time. He kept workers divided into crews, each with specific instructions. When Ghiberti attempted to assert control, Brunelleschi feigned illness, leaving Ghiberti in charge of the site, only to return and point out every flaw in his rival's execution. Eventually, the board recognized that Ghiberti was out of his depth. Control passed fully to Brunelleschi, who from that moment forward directed the project alone. For the next 16 years, he oversaw one of the greatest architectural achievements in history. The dome of Florence Cathedral rose brick by brick without scaffolding, cranes, or precedent. Its herringbone pattern locked the bricks in place. Iron chains within the structure prevented outward thrust. Ingenious hoists lifted tons of stone. Workers lived and ate on the dome itself to save time. The result was not just an engineering marvel, it was a symbol. Florence, the heart of the Renaissance, had conquered the sky. Meanwhile, Ghiberti returned to what he knew best, bronze. He completed the east doors of the Baptistery in 1452, 21 years after beginning them. These were his masterpiece, a sequence of Old Testament scenes rendered in brilliant, high-relief bronze, so intricate and beautiful that Michelangelo himself called them the gates of paradise. They were installed opposite the cathedral, facing the very dome Brunelleschi had built. 2 men, 2 doors, 2 visions of glory. The rivalry continued even in death, however. Brunelleschi was buried inside the cathedral that he had crowned, an honor rarely granted to a commoner. Ghiberti died 2 years later, surrounded by his students and with his name etched into the Baptistery doors. For decades, art historians debated who had been greater, Ghiberti, the sculptor of light and gold, or Brunelleschi, the engineer of heaven. But the truth is, their story was not simply one of opposition, it was one of acceleration. Their competition pushed Renaissance art to evolve from Gothic into classical. Their visions, once competing, now coexist in harmony. Thanks for listening.